Alright guys, I'm back, and back with another CD Project Red Cyberpunk 2077 video. And in this one, and I meant to discuss this probably a couple of videos ago, for the last two videos, been meaning to put this into discussion. But I want to basically discuss the consequences or the need to really take into account um, the third person perspective and why that's so important. And basically, it's to do with the metrics involved. And you have two things going on. You have the size of investment, you have the return on your investment, and you have the mitigating factors that will basically determine the potential for the return in your investment. And basically what I want to address is the nicheness of the or how niche the cyberpunk genre is. Cyberpunk is basically a subset or a subgenre of science fiction. And when you look at things like Altered Carbon, which I thought was an amazing show, I loved the all the actors in that. I especially liked the male lead. A lot of times they get it wrong with the guy, but there's something about this actor, I forget what his name is, that really, and he's actually a Swedish actor, but it really conveyed a lot of the meaning in that show as far as the representation of an elite interplanetary warrior from the future, or from the past, I should say, in that environment. So an excellent show for anybody who hasn't checked it out. I highly recommend it, especially if you're looking forward to Cyberpunk 2077. All right, so having said that, it's still a very niche type of genre. If you look at what happened with um, if you look at what happened with Blade Runner 2049. Actually, if you look at what happened with Blade Runner in general, the first movie actually wasn't a huge financial success. It made its money back, and it made, I imagine, some profit, but it wasn't something like Star Wars or Star Trek or anything in that regard, especially Marvel, where you put money in and you get a whole lot more back. So it's important to realize that. And I know Cyberpunk is growing and it has the potential to grow even more. But from the perspective of a franchise that has really matured, and you can kind of pick your shots, it's really not there. You can't really call the shots with a Cyberpunk game like you could, let's say, a fantasy genre. The Lord of the Rings, you could take a lot more risks in. Turning the first one into a trilogy was a big risk. There was a payoff. The second one was even a bigger risk, because you don't have quite as much, or anywhere near as much material in The Hobbit like you do the Lord of the Rings series. Yet they did it, and it paid off. With Cyberpunk, or with Blade Runner 2049, you actually had a movie with not just an amazing movie, but a movie that had an excellent pedigree. So there was already an established fan base. Not to mention, arguably, a lot of people will tell you it was a better movie than the original. And I'd like to express that whenever I watched 2049, I was much more deeply affected than I was in the original. In fact, to the point where I felt Rutger Hauer's performance from the prior movie, even though I think it was well over 35 years in the past. And that's an amazing, a phenomenal accomplishment. Yet 2049, again, performed very dismally compared to what I'm thinking expectations were. It just wasn't the type of movie, or it didn't give them the type of return that I think they were hoping for. So that's very important to note, because when you have Cyberpunk 2077 come out, you've got a huge investment that is basically hitting a market that is been proven to be very fickle and very niche. To put this into further perspective, again, drawing from the analogy of fantasy, you have a third-person, open world, very heavily story-driven, with an amazing pedigree, 3 games, okay, with an amazing pedigree as far as the narrative source material in The Witcher, okay? And while I understand that Cyberpunk is an established franchise, there's not nearly the quality or quantity of narrative material that you get with The Witcher. So when you look at The Witcher, I think it was an $80 million investment, and I'm not entirely sure if that even includes the marketing associated with that game. So it was an $80 million investment in a genre that is substantially more popular, with a fan base that very much knows what it wants. And what they wanted was a third-person open-world fantasy game with a heavy emphasis on narrative and story. And a good amount of action. Now, it wasn't the best action game, and I get conflicting reports on how good the action is on Cyberpunk as far as the demo is concerned. But we'll say it's fairly well, maybe even better. It's conceivably, it's conceivable that it's better, that they've learned something and they've made it a lot better than it was in The Witcher. But when you take into account that Cyberpunk is a much bigger investment than The Witcher 3 ever was, potentially from a developmental cost, bigger than all 3 of the Witcher games combined, simply because of all the money that the vast amount of resources that have already been poured in and are going to continue to be poured in. And when you take into account it's from a relatively unknown fiction, which is Cyberpunk versus Blade Runner, then you have to understand that the marketing has to be on point too. So what you're basically saying is that they need this game to capture hearts and minds much, much more than The Witcher ever did, within a genre that is arguably much smaller, and with an investment that's substantially bigger, so now your financial exposure is larger. On top of that, you've got precedents for Cyberpunk games, or games in the Cyberpunk genre, like Deus Ex, Mankind Divided, which in its initial run barely made over 700,000 copies sold, and probably still hasn't sold over 1 million copies. This is a huge exposure in and of itself. When you take into account the fact that they're not delivering on this vision that I think a lot of people have for the quintessential open world, third-person, story-driven cyberpunk game, open world game, where you get to also fly or operate flying cars, then you can see, and the very dismissive kind of blasé approach to addressing the customer backlash or concern or request or desire, however you want to call it and frame it. Customers are not happy. They want one thing, and it doesn't seem like these needs are being met or addressed or even cared about. So when you take all this into consideration, when you take in the genre smaller than The Witcher, the financial exposure and the investment in the game is much larger. The marketing for this game is going to need to be even bigger than it was for The Witcher, simply because it's not a very well-known genre. The history of these games not performing. When you take in all these things and you add into dismissing the hardcore, a good portion of your hardcore fan base, this, my friends, is a recipe for disaster. You're going to have some serious hurdles just to make a return on your investment, let alone a runaway success. So, in short, this CD Projeck Red need to listen to its fan base, absolutely, without a doubt. And not listening to us, not listening to you, not listening to me, not listening to anybody who has concern whether it's about the flying cars, which I think is going to end up being much bigger than you guys, any of us realize. I think if there is, I actually made a joke with my girlfriend a few months before E3 about the whole prospect of flying cars in Cyberpunk 2077. And I told her, I was like, honey, you realize that, and I know I keep talking about my TV, and I absolutely love it. And it's intrinsic to the reason I even started this channel. But when, we're looking at a game potentially for 9th gen on a 75-inch 4K television and being able to operate flying vehicles in it. I mean, I joked around like, honey, we're finally going to get flying cars, because that's one of the jokes about the millennium. I'm an 80s kid. I was, I think, I was right around the kids, the age of the kids from, Stranger Things. So I was pretty much an 80s kid, and you got to understand the sense of wonderment. I feel that I'm very fortunate at my age to still have a very healthy sense of wonderment and derive so much joy from things like Marvel movies and science fiction and Star Wars, even though I'm not a huge Kathleen Kennedy fan or Ryan Johnson fan for that matter. In fact, to me, J.J. Abrams was a little passable. But anyway, I digress. And so I remember being a huge fan of futuristic documentaries and futurism in general, and thinking to myself, the world is changing so much. We're getting VCRs. We've got cable TV now. I remember the first time we got a 25-inch color television and how awesome I thought it was. But by the year 2000, we're going to have a colony on Mars, and we're going to basically, we're going to be living in the future, and one of the great things is we're going to have robots and flying cars. Well, funny enough, we may end up with robots and a colony on Mars before we have flying cars, and all flying cars is a smaller airplane. We've already got helicopters. So one of the things I thought, would be so futuristic. Heck, we got camera phones. We've got video conferencing. We've got YouTube. I've got my own television station, for crying out loud. So yeah, I think the whole thing with the flying cars is going to be a bigger letdown than a lot of people, probably anticipate. So, in order to avert this disaster, at the very least, CD Projeck Red has got to listen to its customers. You can't just pretend you're that French restaurant that everybody's trying to get into for the last 6 months, and that you can do absolutely anything you want, and that there's not going to be any consequences. And the fans of the franchise, the ones who do support the first person, can't think that, hey, my support is all they need. No, this is an uphill battle, guys. If Cyberpunk 2077 is going to be successful, and I think we all want it to be, we all have to be happy. We have to make sure that all of our needs, all of our desires are met. Anyways, guys, you tell me what you guys think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Let's keep it civil. If you guys absolutely have to, hit that dislike button, do so. All right, guys. I'll be talking to you guys later, and you guys take care. Bye-bye.